This episode is part of the Utopia podcast series on European literatures and gender from a transnational perspective.
All right, I think I'll do some introductions and then we'll get to the core of it. So as many of you know, Nicoletta Asciuto is a senior lecturer at the Department of English and Related Literature, a modernist, a comparative modernist, a linguist, and a translator. She is just back from Italy, where she presented the work that we're kind of convening around at the Salone del Libro in Turin. And we are joined by Dr. Boriana Alexandrova, who's senior lecturer at the Center for Women's Studies. And I guess we'll be conversing, kind of getting back to your earlier sessions of academic life. So multilingualism and James Joyce and translation as well. We're joined by Zoé and Enora, and they are two third-year students joining us for the readings of Mirrlees' translation of Mirrlees' Paris poem. We're also joined by Professor Kimberly Campanello, whom you will be meeting tomorrow, more kind of officially, but she'll be joining the conversation as well.
Thank you so much, Alice, for the introductions. It's really nice to see you all in this space. So let's begin with the beginning. So Bobby very kindly asked me to talk about my most recent translation project, which was translating Mirrlees' Paris, which is a long poem of 445 lines, written in a mix of English and French. So in the slide, you can see actually an image that I'm quite fond of, and I also used it for the cover for the Italian edition of the translation, where we see Hope Mirrlees in Paris in 1915, actually at the Tuileries Gardens, which you'll hear when we do the readings, is where part of the poem is set. But essentially, for those of you who have no idea of the poem, and I see people have been like, oh, the poem is a day's walk in Paris, experienced by a flâneuse, so a kind of a woman walking along the streets of Paris in the spring of 1919. So World War I has ended, and the world is a very strange place. It's very full of hope, and not to obviously the joke is sort of there. She jokes on she makes also puns on her name as well. It's a place full of hope, but it's also a place full of grief and sorrow and dealing with the anxieties that come after the ending of such a momentous period in Western history. So Paris is written in that moment, and it kind of encapsulates all of this. So this is, I guess, what you need to know in order to follow the poem and understand the poem. And I thought I would just say a couple of words as well in why I got into doing this. And I remember a colleague who shall remain nameless and who's not here today, once asked me, but why do you do this? Why do you translate? Why do you translate that people? Like, if they're not appreciative, and why do you do it? And I said, well, because, first of all, I think it's an act of love towards a complete stranger. So it's something that I do for someone to bring them back to life in this case, and that it's a completely voluntary and personal project in this sense. But also it's bringing back, a period obviously that I'm particularly interested in studying. But the reason how I got into translating Mirrlees' Paris is perhaps interesting for tonight's topic, where we're talking about deep reading and creative practice. I decided to translate Mirrlees' Paris in very, very specific circumstances. So I had already translated a few poems from Spanish and Slovenian into English. I had translated from Italian into English. And I had been reading various modernist women poets, and I discovered Mirrlees again. But then I found myself in the first lockdown in a city where that meant something to me, but I didn't know very well. And I only had one book with me in lockdown. And that book was Sandin Palmer's brilliant edition of Hope Mirrlees collected poems. And so after the first few weeks of adjustment and of, I also had a pretty big admin role in the department at the time, which meant I had basically nonstop Zoom calls. So I decided that translation is something that has helped me before navigate my life, and so has various forms of language learning. So I decide, well, I only have one book that I can call mine. What about translating it into Italian? I had never done that, or I hadn't done that in a while. And I decide, well, why not? And I translated all using only pen and paper because those days, those weeks were full of screen time. And I decided that I just want to recuperate this relationship with words and with deep reading. So I spent hours, where I couldn't go anywhere anyway. And I basically spent so much time with Hope Mirrlees verse. And I don't think that often happens. It's been a privilege. And even as a scholar of poetry, I don't often spend actually that much time with a single verse. And so when Bobby asked me, well, let's talk about deep reading, I thought, yes, I think I know a thing or two, or at least experientially. Yeah. So we'll have a few readings from the original poem in English and French, and my translation in Italian and French, which has mostly been left as it is. And as I said, we have two of my very brilliant students join us here to read the French. So first off, we'll have Bobby and Zoé.
Thank you. And just to give you a heads up, this is a multilingual poem, as Nicolette said, but it also has a couple of wondrous, but also possibly slightly shocking moments of non-lexical onomatopoeic noise, which for me is very exciting, and I'll get to perform it. But this is why I have to take my microphone a bit further away, because I'll be cawing as a seagull. And I wanted to also mention this because it's, it couldn't possibly be Hope Mirrlees directly speaking to James Joyce. However, there is an almost identical line in James Joyce's Finnegans Wake, his famously unreadable, intensely multilingual work that was published about a decade after this one. So, quick heads up.
À Notre-Dame de Paris, en reconnaissance des grâces accordées.
I want a hollow praise.
Nord-Sud, zigzag, lion noir, cacao bloqueur.
Black figured vases in Etruscan tomes.
Rue du Bac, du Bonnet. Solferino, du Bonnet. Chambre des députés.
We are passing under the Zen.
Du Bonnet.
The Scarlet Woman shouting,
Beer.
And deafening Saint John à Padmont.
Vous descendez, madame? Qui souvent se pèse bien se connaît. Qui bien se connaît, bien se porte. Concorde.
I count. I must go slowly. The Tuileries are in a trance because the painters have stared at them so long. Little boys in black overalls whose hands, sticky with clay, are like the newly furled leaves of the horse chestnuts, ride round and round on wooden horses till their heads turn. Pigeons perch on statues and are turned to stone.
Le départ pour Citer.
These nymphs are harmless. Fear not their soft mouths. Some pasteur made the gulls immune against the bite of nymphs. Ah, look! Them bit femme! A red stud in a buttonhole of his frock coat.
The obscene conjugal tutoiement. Mais c'est logique. The esprit français is leaning over him.
Whispering. Secrets. Exquisite. Significant. Fade plastic of the 13th Duchess of Alba. Long as the Eiffel Tower. Fathoms deep in hashish with languid, compelling finger, pointing invisible magi to a little white Maltese. The background grey and olive green.
like Le Midi, the Louvre, La Seine.
Of ivory paper knives, a lion carved on the handle. Lysistrata had one, but the workmanship of these is empire.
I see the Arc de Triomphe,
Square and shadowy like Julius Caesar's dreams, scorn the laws of solid geometry.
step boldly into the wall of the Salle Caillebotte.
And on and on. I hate the Etoile.
The Bois bores me.
Tortoises with gem-encrusted carapace. A Roman boy picking a thorn out of his foot.
A flock of discalciated Madame Ricamier, moaning for the Chateaubriand de nos jours.
And yet, quite near,
saunters the ancient Rue Saint-Honoré, shabby and indifferent, as a grand seigneur from Brittany, an Auvergnat, all the mountains of Auvergne in every chestnut that he sells.
Paris is a huge, homesick peasant. He carries 1,000 villages in his heart.
Thank you. I have to say, first time I hear it read aloud, like it's been with me in the kind of the silence of lonely reading. But I'm really glad that you picked this pattern, because you have this. You went for, in Italian, you went for Pisade, when you're talking about that the painters have said that then Pisade is like, it's brilliant because it's both kind of staring at something, but Pisade is also like to pin down. So it's this bridging of pinning down, and then the steely hands, and there's a wonderful thing that translation can do there, which is emphasizing something. But I think this is a good passage as well to understand what does it mean to deep read when translating. And there's different levels of it, I guess. You were saying how you translated pen and paper, and in the introduction you say to recuperate the physical labor of translation. But then there's deep translation. There is this poem in particular, and it's all the layers that are there. And every time they read it, it's something else. It's the paintings, and it's the history of Paris, and it's all of that. But then there's also you and your deep reading, and the deep reading of translation. So if we want to start there, somewhere in deep reading, where is it?
Yeah, definitely. I think every act of translation is necessarily an act of interpretation. You know, when we translate something, we necessarily interpret it for someone else, for the other audience. Even when we do this on I'm sure most of you here do it on an everyday basis without thinking, oh, but especially thinking about family relationships, like how do you translate certain things? It's very important. It's how you interpret something, right? But suddenly I think something that you said, Alicia, on a different occasion, you said that my translations also sound like me, like they sound like my voice, and that there's certainly some phrases that that I think someone else would have said very differently. And it's also true to say that every translation is also a work of the translator, and says so much about their work. And certainly some of the Italian expressions here as well, I think, are probably very, very mine. So maybe we could read the Italian opening.
À Notre-Dame de Paris, en reconnaissance des grâces accordées.
Voglio un'olofrase.
Nord-sud, zigzag, lion noir, canard bloqueur.
Basi a figure nere nelle tombe etrusche.
Rue du Bac, du Bonnet. Solferino, du Bonnet. Chambre des députés.
Bracacax, coax, coax. Passiamo sotto la Senna.
Du Bonnet.
La grande prostituta grida,
Bière.
assordando San Giovanni a Patmo.
Vous descendez, madame? Qui souvent se pèse bien se connaît. Qui bien se connaît, bien se pose. Concorde.
Non posso. Devo muovermi lentamente. Le Tuileries sono in trance perché i pittori le hanno fissate così a lungo. I ragazzini dalle salopette nere e dalle mani appiccicose di gioco sono come le foglie, appena arricciate, degli ippocastani, Vanno sempre in tondo sui cavallucci di legno fino a che le loro teste non cominciano a girare. I piccioni stanno appollaiati sulle statue e diventano pietra.
Le départ considère.
Queste ninfe sono innocue, non temere le loro morbide labbra. Un certo Pasteur ha reso i galli immuni al morso delle ninfe. Guardate! Gambetta, una coccarda rossa nell'occhiello della sua redingote. Lo sceno tutoiement coniugale.
Mais c'est logique. L'esprit français.
Si piega su di lui, bisbigliando, segreti, ricercati, importanti, insipidi, classici, della 13ª duchessa di Alba, spilungone quanto la Torre Eiffel, 1000 leghe sotto l'hashish, con un dito languido e convincente, indica dei re magi invisibili a un piccolo maltese bianco, lo sfondo grigio e verde oliva.
Come il midi, il Louvre, la Sena.
Di certi coltellini d'avorio, leone intagliato sul manico, l'Esistrata ne aveva uno, ma la loro fattura è stile impero. Di
Vedo l'arco di trionfo.
squadrato ed enigmatico, come i sogni di Giulio Cesare. Disprezzare le leggi della geometria solida, entrare audacemente dentro la parete della sala Calbot, e così via. Detesto l'étoile, il bois mi annoia. Testuggini dal carapace incastonato di gemme, un ragazzino romano si toglie una spina dal piede.
Un grece di Madame Mécanier, Salsay, per avere Chateaubriand d'un jour.
Eppure, proprio qui vicino, passeggia per l'antica Rue Saint-Honoré, trasandato ed indifferente, come un gran signore bretone, un alverniate, tutti i monti dell'Alvernia in ogni castagna che vende. Parigi è un contadino immenso, gli manca casa sua, serba 1000 borghi nel suo cuore.
If I can continue what you were saying about the intimacy of translation and the ways in which translation, the act of translation places us in such an intimate and intense relationship with the text and the person, sometimes people, voices, contexts that created in the first place. And I guess from my perspective, I think about, I look back on working with Joyce's Finnegans Wake, which for those of you who are not familiar with Joyce's Finnegans Wake, it was his final book, which all of his, many of his friends and his greatest champions, including Harriet Shaw Weaver, who was responsible for essentially financing his extravagant lifestyle, because Joyce was lucky enough to be to have patrons and not have to work and just got to focus on his writing. What a lucky man. But Finnegans Wake, even Harriet Shaw Weaver thought was a bit of a fool's errand. It was a very experimental text. It's a multilingual text, but multilingual, unlike anything else, it amalgamates over 80 different languages. So he creates these very interesting multilingual portmanteaus, which has led a lot of his readership to pronounce this text unreadable. But actually, in my experience of working with Finnegans Wake, and it was one of the reasons I picked it up in the first place, because I'm told it's unreadable, it's untranslatable. Many scholars, including many translators, actually have complained about its inherent untranslatability, but it has been translated. So the question, of course, of what do we do with all of these multilingual codes and word games, it's a complex one that we don't really have the space to get into here. But something that struck me as a reader of the Wake, and my key into the Wake, wasn't actually trying to translate it as such. For me, the key in Finnegans Wake was embodying it, which I think you were prompting us to reflect on deep reading as a practice of relating to our texts and ultimately relating with each other and even relating amongst ourselves as readers. And something very peculiar about the Wake is even if you don't understand the words inside, which the vast majority of the language of the Wake is honestly uncrackable unless you do a lot of research and unless you maybe speak a good portion of these 80 languages amalgamated within it. But one key that you can use with the Wake is to simply read it aloud, to simply embody it. And then something interesting that happens with that is one of its features is that it operates in multiple narrative layers. So you may have kind of the visual layer, right? The words on the page. And as you look at the words on the page, you might be able to catch a few words that you can recognize in any of the languages that you know, because chances are your languages will somewhere be represented in there. But there is another layer. There is the phonological layer. So when you read it aloud, something else, sometimes completely unrelated to the visual, appears. So there are actually multiple narratives, multiple stories being told at the same time, and you will pick it up depending on how you're reading. And then there is you, the reader, right? What accents would you bring to the table? What about if you have I don't know, some kind of difference in how you speak? So what if you lisp? What if you like your consonants extra crisp, like us Slavic speakers do? What if you are particularly musical or simply pronounce the vowel combinations in a very particular way? You're going to reveal yet another narrative layer. And that, I think, is a really interesting thing that happens with translation that we often take for granted. If we think about translation in the abstract and we think, well, there's text A and then we're going to convert it into text B. But it's never that, is it? You are always there. And Zavicha picked up your voice in your translation as well.
Definitely, yeah. I think it's sort of an about. I think this is one of the arguments I have against AI translation. Overtaking literary translation, because ultimately we're always looking for a voice and style in poetry, especially. So I'm hoping that I'm gonna be proven right in the long run.
It hadn't occurred to me to think about AI translation, because whose body is it then? If we talk about embodiment.
No, I think that's very interesting, and also it brings up the question of reading out your own translations as well, which I remember that when I first sent off sort of the first draft to someone new, then they sent it to someone else who apparently was really into poetry, and that person fed back. I never knew who this person was, so I never met them. This person fed back that the English already was very, very difficult to read and sort of unreadable aloud. But I think today we're proving them wrong.
The most of Père Lachaise is walking the streets.
He is draped in a black harloon embroidered with the letter H. He is hung with paper wreaths. He is beautiful and horrible, and the close friend of Rousseau, the official of the douane.
Lo spettro di Père Lachaise.
Cammina per le strade, trappeggiandosi in una tenda nera ricamata con la lettera H. Agghindato di corone di carta, è bellissimo e orribile, è un caro amico di Rousseau, il verniere. Okay, so I think we had this just as a very kind of brief sample of what goes on. And I think one of the things that one of the elements that I find particularly interesting about this poem is the fluidity of times, but also the fact that the city comes alive with all the different ghosts that have inhabited it. And now, if you look at a passage like that, it's sort of remarkable to me that I'm assuming that a lot of you will be familiar with T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. And T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland is actually written after this text, and it was published by the same editor for the same series. So in a way, there's a lot to be said about how a woman author is actually prefiguring, pre-imagining very, very similar ideas and images, which we then have in literary history, or certainly in the 20th century, we have always associated with a certain male author. So I thought that this might be interesting to you, especially as part of the network, because we are working on gender and what it does. And this is certainly one of the things that fascinated me as a T.S. Eliot scholar myself, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, as a good Roman Catholic would say. It's interesting that the things fall in and out of sight authors are in the limelight and then they're not anymore, and then I'm very much fascinated by the construction of the canon and what happens to it. So she writes herself in it, definitely in that passage with the letter H. So
I loved also that in the Italian it's H and not H, which I think is so much more lyrical and dramatic. How would you pronounce if you're reading this in French? I mean, H is a silent consonant.
But if it's a letter, then we'll say H.
Even that, if we think about the onomatopoeia of this poem as it translates into different languages,
yes,
read in different accents, it will make different noises.
yeah.
And it really makes me wonder. I mean, one of the reasons we wanted to read it for you is because actually, if you look at the page, it can be quite confusing if you don't know the places or the names. There are loads of place names, throwaway little phrases that are not really delineated in the text in any way. So you don't really know who's speaking. You might know where you are if you know Paris, but if you don't know Paris, it's very difficult to kind of keep track. It's a map that really doesn't announce itself very helpfully. But when you start to read it, then you have to make these kinds of decisions. Okay, what's actually happening here? And is the wind blowing, or is somebody having a cough? So the drama of it feels very exciting.
Definitely, no, and it brings, there are several questions that kind of happen in translation, and I think we selected the next excerpt just precisely because it's again a short passage. It's a passage that that in my lockdown days and afterwards I kept thinking about, and I really don't know if I ended up translating it. We might want to say faithfully, but faithfully is not right, but in the best possible way. But maybe we could read that and then talk about it afterwards and see what everyone thinks.
Yankees. And say, besides that in Aleppo once,
Mary Avardira and Karen Pronant of the Peace Carnival.
cracked veils, mouths pursed up with lips solved as if they had just said,
Chocolat. Elle se balance sur les hanches.
lizard eyes, Assyrian beards, boots with cloth tops. But a tart little race, whose brain, the Arab said, was one of the three purchase of the spirit of God.
Oui, c'est passionnant. On en a pour son argent. Le fromage n'est pas un plat logique. Ah oui, c'est un délicieux garçon. Il me semble que toute femme sincère doit se retrouver en anagramme.
Yankees. E di inoltre che una volta ad Aleppo
Diversi marinai e Karen prenante del carnevale della pace.
veli di crepe nera, bocche increspate con lucida labbra, come se avessero appena detto
Chocolat. Elle se balance sur les hanches.
occhi da lucertola, barbe a stire, stivali dai bordi di tessuto. Il piccolo popolo inacidito, il cui cervello, dicevano gli arabi, era uno dei 3 trespoli dello spirito di Dio.
Oui, c'est passionnant. On en a pour son argent. Le fromage n'est pas un plat logique. Ah oui, c'est un délicieux garçon. Il nous semble que toute femme sincère doit se retrouver en anagramme.
So it's an exceptionally difficult, I think, passage. I mean, the thing to be said is certainly that Mirrlees is walking along the streets of Paris. She's picking up phrases and things that she hears, and that's definitely true. And I think in this, she very much mimics what's the kind of the French avant-garde was also doing, and the futurists. We might think of them. But the problem I had was, apart from the boots with cloth tops, whatever those are, if anyone can picture them, then please let me know, or make a drawing, like you could try for me. But the big problem I had was the sentence, the Tardilo race, whose brain, the Arab said, was one of the 3 purchase of the Spirit of God. And I never fail to bring this up because I'm in the hope that at some point someone somewhere will say, I know exactly what that means because I've heard this or I know this. And but it's difficult because I couldn't find any reference to, so I asked around and I looked around and I couldn't really find any reference to a specific proverb or thing that had been said. So I didn't know who the race was. Now the context is that she is, as I said, she's writing in 1919. It's the year of the peace conference. The Armenian population had just suffered obviously several murders, and the scholarship thinks that she's referring to the Armenians. But just before we have reference to the Assyrian beards, could be the Assyrians, also the Jews were not necessary, we're not super popular at the time, just to vary. So who is the Tarlilo race? And the problem I had was that not so much about who it was and why it mattered, but also translating the word race was difficult to me because, as perhaps Italian speakers in the room know, the immediate translation would be razza, but that's of Nazi-fascist connotations, and no one really uses it anymore to talk about race in the same context as English. So I didn't want any Italian reader to stop and think, what? So I decided to translate it as nation, or rather people, so popolo. And then the other issue that I had was tart, because tart, what does that mean? It's like tart is it's something that's kind of slightly sour and tingy on the tongue, but why are these people sour? Like I don't know. I kept asking myself this question. So again, in the hope that someone at some point tells me, but so I decided to translate it as inacidito, so the people that have become sour because of something that's been done to them. So in a way, I have glossed it for the Italian reader, I think, and tried to make it more accessible. I loved how the tongue also stumbles on the kind of three perches, which becomes a tetrespoli, but the image is difficult.
It goes to show how long you have to spend on every decision in translation, what a laborious process it actually is.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I think he's also pointing out that like something maybe that we kind of forget as academics or as people who deal with texts, and perhaps we like to think of ourselves as solitary creatures. And I think the setup for you was also the lockdown, so that is naturally a solitary experience, but actually what we've enacting in this moment and what you've enacted in your sentence asked around is like, it's pointing at the fact that translation cannot be a solitary experience, that it's got to be a collaborative experience, whether it's someone else reading it aloud in, different accents or crispier vowels or consonants or more open vowels or whatever it is. And so, the intrinsic collaborative networky nature of translation itself, I think, has got a place that needs kind of emphasizing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's basically what I also teach, that translation, is wrongly perceived by our outsiders, I think, as a solitary business, but actually no, because you have, you'll always come across something that actually needs glossing. And in fact, I was only recently in other authors' archives, so not these ones, and I found an exchange between two translators when one asks the other, "So could you please tell me how you would translate this? But please do it soon, because otherwise, I have to submit my manuscript tomorrow." And this was just by telegram, so it was really fascinating to see. Oh, this was in the 60s, so but yes, just very interesting.
Yeah, and I often also think about both the tangible and intangible collaborators, participants in any text. But I think, I think you used the word ghosts earlier, and of course in Paris, in the poem, it revives ghosts a fair bit, whether via street names, because of course streets have specific names for a reason, and we don't often really get to question. We don't have time. We're usually passing by a street sign without really paying attention to it. In the act of translation, you actually have to look and think and and uncover, actually find out, who is this? Actually, somebody just named in passing. But I also think about all the other characters that are present in any reading. And I think we often forget about the ghosts as well. who are the other ghosts? I mean, one that comes to mind for me from my reading of the Wake. At some point, I talked about in my book. I talked about this phenomenon of multilingual homecoming in the space of the Wake. So the Wake is a very estranging text. It's very difficult to read. Paris is in many ways a very estranging text, but as much as they push us away a little bit, they make us work for their love, really, these texts. At the same time, they give us a bit of space. They do invite us in, but they want us to be willing to be present on their terms. And they want us to be willing to spend the time, as a translator would, to spend the time with them, to try and understand them, even though they are difficult. And it places us in this interesting, in a different paradigm of relating, which is something that is, for me, very fundamental to reading multilingual texts. And one of the reasons why I think it's not just that the texts themselves are multilingual, but we have to become, we have to embrace the strangeness, and we have to allow ourselves to feel strange and uncomfortable. So the comfort of fluency, that's not the brief. The brief is you have to get out of your comfort zone, become a foreigner, and stumble over your words and stutter and not understand everything, and just deal with that and still stay in the relationship. And what would you do then, right? If the relationship is difficult, I mean, because most of the time, right, we just go, well, this is a bit too tough. I think I'll just, break up with you. But being willing to actually be here and enter into a kind of loving relationship with these texts, we have to try much harder than that. And some surprising things happen in the process. And so in the example of multilingual homecoming, that idea for me came when I read a passage in The Wake, which The Wake does have some Bulgarian, which is my native language. Not very much, because Joyce really didn't know any Bulgarian. I mean, he didn't know most of the languages he used, but he also knew a fair few. Anyway, he had a little bit more access to Russian. He didn't really know any Bulgarians. So there isn't that much of it, but every now and again it is there. And I did sense it in one of those hallucinatory moments of reading The Wake at some point. And there's this phrase later on that goes, yasha yash, a sausage and mash. Not sausage, sausage. Yasha yash, a sausage and mash. And as I read it aloud, as I had at that point become accustomed to doing, I thought, well, first of all, yash in Bulgarian means eat. It's an imperative, eat. So yasha yash, eat. But Yasha also sounds like Sasha, which is a very common nickname for someone named Alexander. And that's, as you gather from my name, Alexandrova, that's my dad's name. His name is Alexander Alexandrov. By his own choice, mind you. He chose his last name. I don't know why. Anyway, his ghost came up for me in this tiny little onomatopoeic multilingual, and the onomatopoeic, the material came through because of the multilingualism of the text. And my dad came up for me, and then I started hallucinating my dad and all of his stories around food, but also relationships, but also fraternity, because Yasha Yash is also a reference to one of the archetypal characters in The Wake. There are two twin brothers who have a very dramatic relationship. Again, I won't go into it. But so many different ghosts came up just because of the multilingualism, because of my relationship to him, because of the Bulgarian. And these ghosts were there because of my languages and story. And this happens for every single reader. Anyway, I just think that's fascinating.
Kimberly, you can feel free to say no, but when you were talking about words and the limits that we have on words, and I'm going back to the podcast that we recorded for the Utopia project, and at some point you say, my poetics is comes from my experience in France and using the words you have to find what you need. So I don't know if you wanna say something on that.
Yeah, and thank you everybody for everything said so far. And I think I mean, first, before I answer that question, I just want to go back to the part about the village in Paris and the many hearts of the village, because it makes me think of Joyce, and it makes me think of the common saying at Dublin in Hiberno English, which is the definition of a Dubliner, it's a countryman's son, which ties, directly to some of the kind of candidissimo that is invoked in your line, Nicoletta. So I think, one of the things about that line is I had this sort of ghosting moment of mind reading of Joyce, just through this translation into Italian via having lived in Ireland. So I think that's the other thing is in my work, I think because I grew up in Indiana, and I think there is some sense if you're a Hoosier, you're a Midwesterner, that you're literally told you're from flyover country, and that there's nothing really there, so that you're flexibly everything, which of course is absolutely not true, and belies the kind of settler colonial attitude towards the spaces and languages and people who are there and who have come. But I think as a result, I always felt a bit, I need to work extra hard to understand as many languages or to take in as many languages as possible. So for me, reading Joyce quite early in high school and reading Dante quite early in high school and trying to do the tough thing, it felt illuminating, as opposed to difficult. So that affective response to not because you want to get marks, so because you want to do a less obvious thing and you believe that there's something less obvious than the words that seem to sort of stand for something. So I think that for poets, we ultimately distrust the stability of language, and that's what we make things with is that instability. And we all feel that instability profoundly, but we're told we're not supposed to, and we're marked on it sometimes. But I think the roundabout answer is that the way that both Nicolette and Bobby have talked about their relationship to the language and to translation is something that for me is why I read. To me, reading is the old saying, reading is writing, writing is reading. But I think it's true. It just yields and yields and yields endlessly. I mean, Nicoletta's versions of my poems are so much better. So I think that's the other thing is the dialogue is about, what language is doing right now in this moment, which has already changed. And we feel that profoundly in Joyce because it's so long.
Yeah, no, I guess that's the privilege of working and interfacing with someone with whom you then can actually talk.
So my question kind of brings together my reading of both of these geniuses in front of us, their work, and the longer term products that you're both working on, and you haven't had a chance to talk about your current project, but Nicoletta's critical book, which we saw launched a couple of months ago on modernism and light, and the translation which we've heard, in my mind, reveals that kinesthetics of language and image, that it's not a kind of static relationship, as I've been saying, that there is this kind of spatio-ethical relationship created through attending to those boundary crossings. The flaneur is more than just a kind of attitude. There's something profoundly ethical called into question in crossing streets, maps, borders, and the street signs themselves point to so many different positionalities in and of themselves. And then, of course, in your critical work, the edges of light and darkness, which you show, are rather in between,
Yeah.
which is part of the point. And so it's not a decorative gesture ultimately, which is part of where, in my mind, Eliot may or may not head more in that direction, which we could debate. Whereas, and Bobby's work on Joyce, for me, considers, I think, multilanguaging as a kind of primary, kind of elemental, foundational layer of reality, if there is such a thing. If there is, it's probably there. And rather than a kind of tricksy intellectual flourish, so it's not a kind of, again, a kind of decoration or something to make us look smart, or something that the way Stein's work is read, or Joyce's work is read, it's something that's pathological and that's problematic. So this seems to relate, in my mind, to Cahun's bodily ethics and the way that creative political practice in the embodied translation that you're describing, whether it's in isolation or with others, or ghosted, or practically speaking, political and archival, is iterative rather than derived. So it kind of ties us back to some of those debates that found around essentialism. But I don't think it does. I think it's doing something much more complex, and which is why I want to ask you to talk about what I'm calling deep living. So the way in which a kind of deep living that whether it's language or not seems to be a feature of your criticism and your creative work. And I wonder if you might reflect on that kind of those experiential materialities is what I'm calling it, and how that manifests in your criticism and practice.
Sure. Thank you so much. What a generous question. What a generous reading. Actually, I still get surprised when people actually read something I've written. So thank you so much. And then let alone actually understanding it to ask such a or caring enough to ask such a generous question. So thank you. So, I mean, I guess if I were to answer this question through Joyce, I would probably answer it a bit differently. To answer the question through my work with Claude, Cahun, Marcel, and more, and I pronounce their name Cahun because, again, I like consonants because of the languages I have. So Claude, Cahun, and Marcel Moore, for those of you who are not very familiar with them, so they are from the same moment in time. In fact, I don't know if they knew Mirrlees, but they certainly knew Joyce because they hung around in Sylvia Beach's and Adrien Monier's Shakespeare and Company bookshop in Paris at the same time. And Cahun and Moore actually volunteered for Shakespeare and Company, but I think they were small potatoes, considered small potatoes compared to the great modernists that lingered there, like Joyce, etc. Anyway, they were part of the more political surrealist circles of Paris. And they were, for example, performers in avant-garde theater. They were photographers, and that's actually in the Anglophone world. They're most famous for their gender-bending photography. They were also very prolific writers, but most of their writing, so their writing in the 20s and 30s was, they wrote quite a lot of polemic as anti-Nazi resistors. So they were part of the various resistance circles that are, so they feel quite involved in this international collaborative campaign against fascism. And they also were in a lot of communist circles, but there was quite a lot of turmoil in those communist circles. And then, so that was throughout the 20s and 30s that they wrote a lot of polemic, made a lot of photography, though mostly for themselves, for each other, wrote a fair few poems, and Cahun also wrote their most famous work, Avenue, or Castle Confessions, which has in fact very recently had a brand new translation. Just this year, actually, a brand new translation of Castle Confessions came out by Susan Demuth. So I highly recommend. It's a beautiful edition by Thin Press. And then in the late 1930s, they moved to the island of Jersey, the Channel Island, in order to try and escape some of the fascist kind of tensions going on in France at the time. But unfortunately, the Nazi occupation caught up with them pretty quickly in 1940. And so they proceeded to mobilize this 2-woman secret resistance campaign, which I'll try not to go into because it's too exciting. But in any case, they were both, besides being so involved in working as multimedia artists, I feel a kind of searching for a multilingualism of a different kind. So if we think about, what is language? Are French and English and German, etc., separate languages? Is that all language is? With multimedia artists like Cahun and Moore, well, they were also photographers, they were also theater performers, they were collage makers, they made costumes, they expressed themselves in various ways. So to me, their multimedia work was very much a searching for languages that didn't exist yet, a searching for somehow articulating the unspeakable, the unutterable. One of the things that they were both very interested in the 1920s was the burgeoning at the time literature on sexology and gender. And as a queer couple, they both also were one of the few examples from the modernist period that really quite explicitly tried to explore the non-binary or the beyond gender or the multi-gender position. So rather than thinking about going from A to B, transsexualism, or gayness in that kind of a binary way, they were actually constantly trying to unpack the binary. And to me, their exploration of different media and different languages, which they also had different languages. They both spoke French, of course. They also were fluent in German. Cahun was also fluent in English. So all of their work in their entire archive is very multilingual, which is one of the reasons, for example, why in the merry posse of multilingual collaborators that I'm working with at the moment on this Giving More project, we all came together because we all have expertise in different languages and different parts of that archive. So collaboration is essential, is one of the reasons why Cahun and Moore's work, especially their writing, hasn't really been explored very much, because it's actually quite difficult to piece it together. It's very multilingual. You need a team of people to do it usually. But I think for them, the unspeakable and actually the places where language isn't really available or accessible, this is the key. And especially in their later work, so they were eventually caught by the Nazis for their resistance activities. They were imprisoned and sentenced to death, and survived by luck. So after they were liberated from prison, they attempted to put their stories of the occupation and imprisonment and the trauma of it all to words. And the preoccupation of these final writings is very much, whatever happened to us, we can try and hold the space for it in the spaces between words. But all of it is unspeakable. All of it is unutterable. And this is something that the unspeakability is a preoccupation of a lot of Holocaust literature and a lot of Holocaust memoirs for this very reason. How can you possibly verbalize the horror of those experiences, and of living death? Living death is something that persists in a lot of these narratives.
I don't know if I'll be able to answer the question in such an eloquent way as Bobby's, but I think, I mean, what I'm interested in is, because I study, by and large, I study a period that's situated 100 years ago. In a way, every recent bit of research that I've done was in trying to recuperate as much of it for myself, but for the reader, in a way that I really want. I think anyone picking up, certainly my monograph, will have a sense of actually visualizing a lot of the period. And this is what Mirrlees does too in her poems, in the sense that she adds a lot of visual references, posters and things that actually we might want to research and kind of, because we're temporally, historically distant from that moment, but it enables us to actually inhabit and embody that historical moment in a way that I don't know that a lot of scholarship necessarily does, or a lot of literature necessarily does. A lot of the kind of scholarship on modernism has focused on form for a lot of the 20th century, and it's only kind of in the last 10-15 years that then there's been a kind of a going back to the context and bringing back to life the cultures and perhaps we needed to be more distant in order to want to kind of excavate that.
But also this, I think that we've also seen a kind of a shift in modernist scholarship, haven't we, in terms of that attitude to form. What's the point of all of these experimental forms? I feel that at least when I was a student, actually learning about modernism for the first time, I was taught about modernism's obsession with form as something that was just a bit, poets playing language games, and it was, thinking about form in a very abstract and cerebral way. But actually, I think both of us have been finding in our research that form, as you said in your question, Kimberly, form is not ornamental, it's essential, it's the fundamental thing. Actually, the form is doing the thing. It is not simply a box in which we put predetermined meanings. So the form and the multilingualism, the unspeakability and the gaps, they're all actually there to hold the material space for something that is foundational. It's not simply trying to be impressive.
Could I ask a follow-up on that around expertise? Because you both are obviously expert this question of expertise and the non-expert readers that estimate Joyce, but equally the non-expert voices or the varied expertise of these voices in the modernist poem, and then the highly expert field itself, which feels to some people exclusionary. So I wonder if you could both reflect on the state of affairs, if you feel like that's moved on.
I always want to. I think I want to make the literature and the period of the early 20th century more accessible. Essentially, it often happens in the classroom where students think, oh, I thought this was a contemporary literature module, and it turns out actually, these texts are from 100 years ago, and a lot of the references are completely lost on us unless we stop and think and research, because it's even though it might have been well, some of us at least under our parents' generation, we don't necessarily know it as under our skin. So in a way, I try and bring the expertise to visualize the period, feel the period more. And I'm sure that this is true of a lot of scholars working in earlier periods, in the early modern, or because ultimately that's a sort of other, because we never really think about, I mean, we always talk about the other in kind of very, very stable ways, but we never really think of the historical other, the fact that living in the 1920s or the 1910s in another geography was another, like it has to be another for me, because I wasn't there for sure, even though I look old, but I'm not that old. And so it's a necessary, and I don't think we often talk about that as that, but rather, oh, it's difficult, and oh, why did I speak like this in the 18th century? Oh,
But I think this is part of, I think, the joy of, I think, that shift in the paradigm, how we approach reading in the first place. I mean, because I do honestly blame a very small group of Oxbridge scholars of the late 19th, early 20th century, but even the academics, honestly, who just were created a kind of gatekeeping paradigm around reading. And in fact, I don't think that reading, for the vast majority of the history of literature, has actually needed to be that, or maybe I'm just overgeneralizing, but certainly in order to be able to connect with these texts, we actually cannot gatekeep and become obsessive about the abstractions of scholarship. We have to become obsessive about the materialities of scholarship, or what the materialities of scholarship allows us to access in some way, because ultimately, I don't know if any of you find this, but in my experience, the more I am able to establish that intimacy with my material, the closer I feel I get to some kind of understanding to it, the funnier it gets, the sillier it gets, the more I feel like I can see, my authors actually just waking up in the morning and, scratching themselves and thinking, God, I really need a coffee, I feel like if we get to that place of intimacy, if we can really feel them and they come alive, that's when it gets interesting. And we can't do that if we gatekeep and, try to get, if we take our scholarly methodologies too seriously. I think we have to get to a place where the material comes alive, and when it comes alive, it actually, this boundary between specialist and non-specialist completely dissolves. And the last thing I'll say is that in Joyce studies, and particularly in Finnegans Wake studies, the reason we even have a field of Finnegans Wake studies is because of obsessive readers who love crosswords and playing language games. And some of the richest early kind of treasuries, and the earliest form of Wake scholarship was this newsletter that Joyce enthusiasts just passed around, called the Wake Newsletter, and it's punning on litter, garbage, because they didn't take that particularly seriously, but at the same time they took it very seriously. They were very disciplined, and the foundational voices in Finnegans Wake studies are not academics at all. So Roland McHugh, for example, who is responsible for this giant tome called Annotations to Finnegans Wake, which is a kind of a key. It gives us some clues to the references inside so we can follow the text a little bit. He was a biologist. He just was obsessed.
I was wondering whether we should read maybe just the ending.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Relays their time. Alchemy, absinthe, Algerian tobacco, talk, manuring the white violets of the moon. The President of the Republic lies in bed beside his wife, and it may be, at this very moment,
In the Abbey of Port-Royal, babies are being born. Perhaps someone who can't sleep is reading Le Crime et le Châtiment. The sun is rising. Soon les halles will open. The sky is saffron behind the two towers of Notre Dame. Je vous salue, Paris, la grâce.
Alba, l'ora della buonanotte per Verlaine. Alchimia. Assenzio, tabacco algerino, parlare, concimando le violette bianche della luna. Il Presidente della Repubblica è sdraiato a letto accanto a sua moglie e può essere che proprio adesso nell'abbazia di Port-Royal stiano nascendo dei bambini. Forse qualcuno che non riesce a dormire sta leggendo
Le Crime et le Châtiment.
Sorge il sole, a breve apriranno le ali. Il cielo è zafferano dietro le due torri di Notre Dame.
Je vous salue, Paris, la grâce.
This podcast is powered by the European Union and the Central European University Library.